Hey everyone, welcome back to Two Cents for Free. I'm your host, Megan. Today I'm joined by TJ Wey, and we are going to be diving a little bit more into the movie Turning Red. So last week we talked about kind of the parenting aspect, child development aspect of Turning Red. But today we're going to talk a little bit about representation and more of the cultural aspect of this film. So I'm actually going to turn this over to you, TJ, so that you can introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thanks, Megan. Yes, hi, I am TJ Wey. My pronouns are Z and Zer. You basically replace the S and the H sounds with a Z. I am in my day job what we call a money coach, which is a very general term. But for me specifically, that means I help small business owners get a handle on their cash flow and understand how to allocate their money so that they are building a sustainable, healthy business. And this will come out before some new changes are coming down the pipeline that I'm very excited about, but I can't share more now. So if you're interested in hearing more about that aspect that we won't touch on much in the rest of this podcast, then you can follow me on Instagram at tj.wey. And you can also find me on Facebook with the same name.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to dive right into these questions. So I'm so excited to get started on this. So this film is specifically about a Chinese Canadian 13-year-old girl. So, how accurately do you feel that the film portrayed a typical Chinese Canadian family dynamic?
So I want to start off by saying that I grew up in California, so I'm not Canadian. So I won't pretend to know what like the nuances of growing up in a Western culture look like specifically for Canadians, but I can definitely generalize that dichotomy of coming from what is a very traditionally collectivist culture, where you honor your ancestors, you respect your elders, you're seen and not heard as a child. That this was my childhood, being like expected to be grateful for what my parents did, and not that I wasn't, but being told very explicitly that this is how you're supposed to feel. That is, it can be very jarring when you grow up in a Western culture, especially one like America. And I'm sure Canada is a little less to that degree on the independent side of it. But when you grow up consuming content about how like being an individual is so important, freedom and independence, and this is all about like being selfish and being for yourself and being independent of other people and doing like dancing to the beat of your own drum kind of thing, versus coming from a family where they have certain expectations. And then especially immigrant families, they don't come to America with the expectation that they're going to have to be intentional about how they raise their children, about how they make sure that their children grow up with the culture that they grew up with. There's a clear mismatch where immigrants tend to think, oh, my kids are going to naturally understand the culture I came from in my old country. So I've talked to other immigrant children, not just for Asian Americans, but like Jewish families and things like that, where they come from a different physical land. And there's just this gap. And that gap brings up a lot of tension when you're growing up and you're trying to become an adult in your teen years and you want to figure out who exactly you are, but still not cause any rifts in your family. And I think that's a huge thing, at least in Asian American culture, where it's it's a weird thing where you try not to cause trouble because it makes the household just like fall apart. It makes it no fun to be in the house. So you try not to start a fight. And if you do, it's because like you just can't not be yourself or not be the person that you've been raised to be after living in we refer to it as a third culture, where you grow up in a country that has one culture, your family has another, so you actually create a third culture between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that in watching back the film, there was so much that I felt like they displayed that Asian culture that they were shooting for. And I know Domishi is the director and writer is an Asian writer and director herself, and so I don't know specifically what nationality she is. Um,
She's Canadian. Yep.
is she Canadian? Okay.
Yes.
So that makes sense then that she would write a film about a Canadian family. But I was reading some of her quotes throughout this movie, and one thing that she said that really stuck out to me was she wanted to embrace all of the awkward, weird, messy parts of themselves that they're kind of taught to put away or to hide. I think for girls especially, I hope they're inspired to get big and take up space and be loud and hairy and be weird. It's okay and it should be celebrated. And one of the things that we kind of talked about in the panel that I did last week was really how this made people uncomfortable, and um, especially white heterosexual men seem to be very uncomfortable with this concept that girls can be all these things. And I actually read a review that said it showed girls, this is written by a female, but it said it showed girls being unfeminine, being loud and brash and bossy. And I'm like, well, shoot, I'm not feminine at all. No one told me, but I'm like, what? So I think this film is challenging things on a lot of different levels. We're just starting to see diversity in representation in TVs and movies. Netflix has been really good about this, but it's been lacking in a lot of the big theater type films. But we're starting to see it a lot from Disney Pixar. And so this, unfortunately, has some people, there's totally in an uproar over this film. So last week, Cinema Blend managing editor Sean O'Connell had a lot of backlash on him. He published a review that he then deleted, and many people were calling it sexist and racist, and I would completely agree. So what he had to say was, I recognized the humor in the film, but connected with none of it. By rooting Turning Red very specifically in the Asian community of Toronto, the film legitimately feels like it was made for Domishi's friends and immediate family members, O'Connell wrote, which is fine, but also a tad limiting in its scope. So to me, this completely reads as white people being threatened by anything that doesn't look like their own lifestyle. And so I'd love to get your take on this.
Oh, there's so much there. First of all, going back to the like, what's wrong with writing it for people you represent, right? Like that's where all the great stories come from, because they're true. They have all of these elements of truth in it, and if you put some abstraction in it the way you do in Turning Red, then it makes it more palatable. And that's actually, I'm a huge sci-fi fantasy fan, and that's all that is you put aliens in it in order to talk about race or discrimination or like even sexuality. And that's really all sci-fi fantasy is making it so abstract that it doesn't seem offensive because it's suddenly not talking about what it really is in the real world. And I've seen a lot of it, the same thing with when you refer to like comics that talk about superheroes or like X-Men and things like that. They're all about these types of things, but because they're so abstracted, it's easier to consume. So when it's this in your face about this is clearly a specific culture that we're talking about, and it is a collectivist culture that is very different from your white independent, like super individualistic culture, like I can see why that would be the reaction. And I completely agree. And I wouldn't generalize that it's like white people having a problem with it. It's people who don't know where their roots are, people who like their parents didn't pass down to them what country of origin they are, or that it's so mixed that they have no way of telling and they don't have a connection to their past. Like that is the real objection, is them feeling disconnected from the rest of history, that they can't put themselves in a place to say, oh, let me identify with that. We just had St. Patrick's Day, and lots of people who could potentially claim being Irish as part of their heritage love St. Patrick's Day because it gives them a sense of belonging that may not apply to a lot of Americans who are multi-generational American, or and I really think this is more of an American problem, right? In Europe, they tend to like keep track of these things a little better. They have multi-generational households where grandma and great grandma still live with them in Italy and all of that, right? So this is inherently you came to America to be different, and then you got upset that you made yourself so different from the rest of the world that you're using your power to try to push everybody else down in that way. And there's definitely aspects to it, right? If you don't have that sense of attachment, and then especially if you're male and you can't relate to the feminine aspects of it, or like you don't like seeing that a woman can be more than just the flowery aspects that we like to uphold, then that can definitely come up for men. And I, especially in households where like they didn't have a sister or an aunt or somebody else who lived in their household that wasn't just the mom. Like I always feel really sorry when I have a friend that has four brothers. And so the mom is completely outnumbered. And I'm certain that talking about periods does not come up in that household, even though they're very progressive and all of that. But there's no reason to, right? So it doesn't come up. So I'm not surprised that a white male that potentially didn't have those conversations about where exactly they came from or what their family identity came from would say these things that are so insensitive and be like, oh, I couldn't relate. Okay, you didn't. White men don't have to learn to have empathy. Like almost every other demographic in the world has to learn to have empathy for white men, but they never have to have empathy for anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I actually saw the newspaper or website where this was published has come forward with like an apology saying it should have never gone out, which of course they're going to say that.
Yep.
Whether or not they actually saw it before it went out or not, who knows. But I couldn't believe, because I mean, it's Disney Pixar, so their movies aren't really made to be relatable in a lot of cases. So I've seen people, calling them out, saying things like, I mean, are you a Dalmatian? Are you, Monsters Inc? Are you a big white or a big blue furry monster? Like, how are you relating to those films? So I think that Pixar did a great job of making this film relatable, but also making it a glimpse into something other than maybe your personal lifestyle in my case. And I just think they did a beautiful job with this movie. So one thing that stood out to me is how much May's mother disapproved of mainstream culture, especially when it came to the boy band. So I know I'm 34, so this movie was like looking into my early, tween teen years. And so I could remember the whole boy band craze. And my mom also didn't really love the pop culture and the pop music that was going on. But for you growing up, is this something that you witnessed in your family or maybe with families that you knew?
So specifically to the boy band thing, I wasn't so into boy bands because boy bands were all white people at the time, right?
Mhm.
Like the internet wasn't in such a place that I could see the K-pop and the J-pop boy bands. So I didn't really see I didn't have that attraction, that crush that is portrayed in the film, but I do remember having that like rampant crush phase where I had crushes on multiple guys at the same time. And I think there's lots of layers to this, right? Because this is actually good story writing. This is great plot. It's not just that parents objecting to modern culture, like pop culture, which I also believe that like in the 90s, right? Like in our generation, with parents who didn't get an opportunity, didn't have access to a lot of information about getting to go to concerts all the time, or didn't grow up in a place where concerts were that prolific, that the paying like $100 for an experience, an ephemeral experience, like is just abstract to them. They like have no idea what the attraction is in the first place. But as far as the plot of Turning Red goes, it's all about like this is it. When she first objects, it's a secret of why she's so upset about these things or why she freaks out about the potential that her daughter's starting her period. But it's because she knows that the panda will come out when she has these extremes in her emotions. So having crushes, going to a concert that's super exciting with all of her friends, like she knows that these are the things that will excite a teenager, and she's trying to even out and put some more normality into the emotional experience of her daughter. And we don't get that when we first see these objections. We don't know what the story is behind why they're objecting so hard. And I think that's very representative of what it's like to be a teenager, because you don't know what your parents are trying to protect you from. Your parents have decades of experience that they don't necessarily know how to articulate to you in words of why they're concerned about something. And even if they could, if they try to tell it to you, it might come out wrong because nobody's ever fully prepared to be a parent, right? Like takes a lot of a forethought and intentionality and energy to be able to explain that in a way that your children understand. And generally it comes out wrong. So it shouldn't be unrelatable that your parents tried to protect you for something that you didn't understand was bad for you or risky or dangerous that you weren't prepared for. And some people come out of those situations without a scratch and great, and then maybe they're justified in being upset at their parents for being overprotective. But I think this is just a part of growing up, of your as a teenager, you learning to be separate from your family household, and as a parent, trying to still protect your child, but also like trying to fight the concept that you have control over them
Mm-hmm.
at this point in their life.
Yeah, I can see that even in my upbringing, my parents, I can remember wanting to go to my first concert, and we had moved from Missouri to Tennessee. We lived there about a year, and while we were there, Hanson had a concert, and it was free, and it was in a mall parking lot. This is an amazing concert.
Perfect.
Imagine, yes. And I heard about it on the radio and begged my parents, like it was that night, and you just had to show up in the parking lot. We were in the car. I begged and begged from the back seat of the minivan, like, please, can we go? And I can remember, my parents' reactions. They did take me. I was actually really surprised. But that was the only concert I went to possibly until I was an adult, I think. I was 12 at the time. They went with me. We listened for a few songs, then we left. And I think that was the only concert I went to because, I would ask my parents and it was never allowed because one, the, buying tickets to go to something that's going to be over in a couple hours. But also, I was wanting to go with friends, not with an adult. And so even as an older teenager, that was not something that was allowed because who knows what could happen. So that was something that I love music. So that was something that was very tough.
Yes, I love going to live concerts and to live bands. I love Nashville because they always have live concerts or live bands in the bars. But I think you mentioned something I want to highlight for half the world, that as a woman going with your other female friends, or even if there was a guy in the group, right? Like going without parental supervision to something like that is considered extremely dangerous. And like we grew up after the 80s where the news made a big fuss about a lot of child abductions. So we grew up with a stranger danger, don't talk to strangers, like don't like this whole like very antisocial movement in our lives where you didn't even like you stopped talking to your neighbors because of these kinds of things that were happening in media around the 80s and 90s. So it takes on a way different feeling that I feel like needs to be emphasized, because I have a lot of guy friends and they don't understand why I stick to rules so hard, because this is how we're taught as females to be safe, is that you have to follow the rules, that you have to watch all of these things. You have all these extra, there's an old Twitter thread of like how being a woman is like being a bicyclist on a road, and how you have to have like follow all these rules even though you're supposed to have the rights of being on the road. And it got really, really long to relate to just being a woman in general. It was hilarious, but very sad at the same time.
Yeah, this is something I've actually talked about with my husband because he does understand to a degree, but he doesn't understand at the same time. And so, I've had to explain that even though nothing has happened, anything could happen. And there are things you have to do to keep yourself safe. And those aren't taught to little boys, they're taught to little girls. And sometimes they're taught to little boys in ways to help protect girls, but mostly not. Like mostly it's just, if you grow up female, you are taught these things to protect yourself. And it's very frustrating because even the good guys don't really get it. And so it's frustrating trying to convey that. And I have three nieces who are two are adults now, one's still a really young teenager. And yeah, nieces are a ton of fun, but there's also that constant worry that they've been raised well, they make good decisions, but at the same time it's like know what everyone around them are doing. So I totally agree. it's definitely a tough thing that little girls just somehow, we just know. And I mean, I don't remember a specific instance where I was set down and taught things, but at the same time, I know all the things. So, I mean, obviously it's just implicit in our society that we learn those things. So, um, this film, really the emphasis was puberty throughout the entire film. Um, I feel like there was less emphasis on Chinese culture. It was more in the background.
Mhm.
And then it hit on a few, I think, well-known stereotypes, which some I think are true aspects of growing up in an Asian culture. Some may just be things that were put into the story because the viewers could recognize them as stereotypes. So do you feel like more could have been shared, or do you feel like it was enough of the culture in the storyline?
So this is a great question because I actually when I'm on YouTube, right? And I find sometimes they make those clips of like all the Easter eggs that people put in. And so there was an Easter egg video that was super long. It was supposed to be like 200 Easter eggs from Pixar likes to put in like ties to their other properties, right? And one of the Easter eggs that got highlighted, so this was clearly not an Asian person who put this together, said, "Oh, these are the same Asian decorations, these posters. Like this is a tie to this other Asian thing." And I was like, "Excuse me? All that means is that it's spring. That is a sign that says it's spring." Okay, like there's a spring festival, and there are posters that I just asked my roommate. He goes by the Asian market, so I was like, "Hey, could you swing in there and get me one?" But like that is not an Easter egg. That's just
Yeah.
what is representative of the time of year that this movie happened. I do feel like there potentially were some more opportunities that they could have like been a little bit more in your face about what it's like to grow up in an Asian household. I think making dumplings is very quintessential to the experience. I personally actually never like learned to make dumplings because that was like grandma and mom did it and they were so good at it and I don't have any kind of patience. So growing up in like that mixed family, you get to pick and choose whether or not you continue a tradition or you choose to adopt that tradition, right? And as I grow older, I'm more and more looking to adopt traditions that I didn't take the opportunity to learn when I was a child. So things like if anybody's seen the Shang-Chi movie where they talk or they have scenes where they take their shoes off before they even enter the apartment. Like
Mhm.
that would have been something that I would have expected to see in Turning Red. That it's just a cleanliness thing, but it's also like a very common if you're walking into an Asian household, you just have to expect that is what they do. And I wouldn't say like other than like stereotypically they were singing in Cantonese for their their ritual. I think it was actually a fairly sanitized representation of what it's like to be in Asian American culture, and they didn't specify. And I would guess based off of the voice actors and the accents that they used that this family had been in Canada for a couple of generations. So that's actually very normal. If you've been there for a couple of generations, you will have diluted quite a bit. And the tie back is really because they have that temple and because they have this secret that they're trying to hide. That's why they're more likely to hang on to some of the more traditional Chinese behaviors. But they didn't specify that, so it's hard to say how accurate that portrayal really is.
Mhm. Yeah. Another thing was that in the end of the movie, May actually chooses to keep her red panda. And we talked about that a little in the last episode because there was so much symbolism that came from both ceremonies that took place. But in that last one, where she enters the bamboo forest, her mom is a child and she's talking to her mom's inner child, basically. Um, and you can see all the fears that her mom had and maybe why she behaved the way she did. But then in the end, her mom decides to go ahead and bottle up her red panda spirit again, and all the aunties and the grandma does as well. But May keeps hers. And so one thing that I kind of took from that was these other generations maybe weren't ready to step forward and embrace who they really were, but they were giving her the space to do that for herself. So, what did you take away from that symbolism?
That symbolism came away with a lot of different potential avenues, right? My roommate actually pointed out that like when you say my panda, my choice, like that could come out in several different options from like it's basically your body, your choice. Like it's not just like how you use your body, but also it comes into like reproductive rights. And then he referred to it as like, well, now the furry community is going to be all over this. So that's something that came up. I didn't try to follow that train of thinking down that rabbit hole. But for me, the takeaway with the way the whole family approached it, right? We got to the climax, and so spoilers, guys. But if the way their red pandas worked is that all they had to do was break the talisman that was holding it back to then go and adopt that strength from that identity, then it's not a real problem per se. Like it's not a long-term problem. It's not a choice that you had to make during puberty that would impact you for the rest of your life. You had the option to go back and change your mind. And I think that's super important to emphasize because I'm my philosophy is in generally empowering people to make a choice, giving them permission to make a choice, that a change that works for them in that moment. And it doesn't have to be a permanent choice. So I think that was really important that they found a reason that identity that they were hiding gave them strength, that it was useful and they pulled it out when they needed it. And they made a decision that the rest of their life didn't need that identity, or it would be as they term it. I really love that they used the emphasis of whether it was convenient or inconvenient. They decided that it was more convenient to mask that part of them, versus May was in a position where it was such a benefit, right? That her peers loved her as the red panda, that she got a lot of notoriety from it. She had strength from it, all these things that incorporating it into her life benefited her that may not have been the case for other generations for various different reasons. That she got to do that and incorporate it into her full identity. And that can represent so many different things, right? Like, for personal example, right? Me growing up in the Bay Area, I didn't have to hide being Asian. That was just a fact that everybody was Asian. I graduated from a high school where 90% of our graduating class was some kind of Asian. So this wasn't something that I used to have to hide. And then I actually went to college at Arizona State University, and that was my first time encountering. Oh, I want to be specific about this. It was mostly the students from the Midwest that came to Arizona because, you know, Arizona's next to California. They're used to seeing LA and San Diego people. They've seen Asians before, but they have not. But the Midwesterners have not seen them in person. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I learned that it was a little bit inconvenient to be Asian, that it was a mental burden to have these conversations, that growing up, it was a myth to have to answer the question of like, oh, where are you from? No, where are your people from? Or, oh, you speak good English. First of all, my English majors, I speak English well. Generally, when you're a foreigner, you speak English better than English speakers, okay? But like those types of conversations I never had to have growing up until I came to college. And then when you go into corporate America, it's also, again, something where you learn to be more convenient, you learn to sanitize, and the definition of professional has come into question a few times lately. I think more often for Black and brown people that we start questioning these, but I've been starting to ask myself as an Asian American, like what part of how I behave as a professional is actually more because it was convenient for the white culture to hide this aspect of myself. Like, why don't I used to only wear my qipao, my like Chinese traditional dress on Chinese New Year's. Why? What was stopping me? I love these things. They're absolutely beautiful. Other than like some of the ones I have don't fit quite right, so they're not work appropriate from that standpoint. Like these types of things are like an aspect of like what Turning Red is saying is older generations were taught to sanitize themselves, and that May has made this choice that she's going to go ahead and embrace who she is. She might change her mind later, but for now, at least, she is going to be everything that she can be in every way that she enjoys and accept the aspects that might have been considered inconvenient otherwise.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the Midwest. So I'm from Missouri. I've lived here my whole life, other than like a year when we were in Tennessee. But I lived very close to Kansas City. I was in a suburb, so very large school where it wasn't as uncommon that there were people of different nationalities, people from different countries, people who maybe were like there was a family who moved from Hawaii. And so and then another family that had moved from Laos. So they were very recent immigrants. But then there, of course, are people who have spent their whole lives here, generations here, who maybe just look different than the traditional white, the Midwesterner. But I then so we moved to Tennessee when I was 12. And then while I was still 12, we moved back. So they're like 10 months. Then we moved to a very tiny town, about an hour away from where I used to live. My graduating class had, I think we were 15 or 16 people in the entire graduating class. I would have graduated with 500 at my previous school. So culture shock. I didn't really understand racism. I had never seen it in my previous school. Then I moved, to this tiny, tiny little area, and it was just like abundant and in your face, and just in casual conversation, like the things that people said, I'm like, do you really think that? Like, do you think because someone looks differently than you that you're smarter, or you're, whatever, insert whatever stereotype? And it's amazing to me just how much people, they believe it because they were taught it and they don't question it. And it honestly, I mean, I've lived here since 2000 and it still is mind blowing to me. I have a friend who we were shopping one day, and we came out of this mall and she wanted to duck in another store real quick. And I'm like, we already went into this store. Did you forget something? And she just kind of motioned behind us. Well, earlier in the day, we had seen two African-American boys at like getting a pretzel at Annie Ann's. Like they were probably late teens, maybe early 20s. There was nothing, like no situation. They just were buying pretzels. But that's who she thought was behind us. And then when she turned, it was a white couple. And then she's like, oh, never mind. I don't need anything. And I was just speechless because like, I don't even know how to begin to address this. And I mean, obviously it needs to be addressed, but I don't even like, it's something that in my head is so mind boggling that I don't have words to say what the F just happened. Like, that's what I really want to say.
I mean, that really is like the only response, right? When you come from a little bit more progressive of a space, or you're used to being more intentional about what how racism integrates into your subconscious mind, right? Because like as much as growing up as a person of color would hypothetically make it easier for me to not be racist, I definitely still got surrounded by racism about other ethnicities within the Asian culture or other people of color, right? This is something that is very common because of the way media is and the way like those stereotypes are just so like that. Stereotypes are just algorithms you use in your head to make thoughts easier, to reduce mental burdens. So when people believe stereotypes that they're told, it's because they're not thinking, because they're not using critical thinking. They haven't put the energy and effort behind deciding whether or not that's true for them, or if this is just like a way to get like for the entertainment industry to build some drama and make some very easy tropes, right? Because that's what it is. Stereotypes make tropes, which make great like cliche movies, and they're super consumable. They sell that way. So there is a capitalist machine behind making sure that people believe these things. And if you don't ever have a lived experience that tells you otherwise, or if you don't have a friend that goes, what the F just happened here? Like, then you're going to just continue to believe it because it's easy. It reduces the mental burden on you. And especially when you don't have another type of minority status that sits on top of it, you never have to question it because the world is built for you. So you go about your day and you enjoy a privilege that you don't realize you have. And it's not that I blame anybody for like enjoying the privileges they have. I totally like as a woman, I'm like, okay, if you have a rule against punching women, then great. I'm going to be in your face and I'm going to talk to you the way I need to talk to you to stand up for myself without worrying about getting punched. Because like I have other disadvantages from that identity that I might as well take advantage of the benefits as well. But yeah, like that, having these conversations with people who don't realize what they've insinuated into their subconscious about other people. It's really tough. It's hard to figure out where to start, and it takes a lot of trust.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really, that's the foundation of it. Like, doesn't really matter how you approach it. You have to already have that level of trust that you mean well and that you're trying to do good, and you're not accusing them of, like, these days calling somebody a racist is like such a slur. And I I feel the need to point out that everybody is racist, and it's a very human nature thing to do, to find a reason that you are in the in group and somebody else is in the out group. And it's super easy to use something that somebody can't change about their exterior appearance as that criteria, because then you can make that decision really quickly without really thinking about it. So it's entirely natural to categorize people by the way they appear. It's the way all animals are built. This is how people did, or like there's so many studies, and there, if you look at other cultures, that like it's not just like down to the race, it's down to the skin tone, or there's caste systems and things like that. um but yeah, like I really think, like, when you come up to one of those situations, generally the only response is, what the F just happened? And it takes a lot of digesting and thinking to figure out, okay, was there something that could be done, a discussion that needed to happen, or is it something where it's not worth the effort and you have to just let it go?
Yeah. And, I've had friends who, so my youngest brother is Haitian. He was adopted when he was 3, and he's 18 years younger than me. So really big age
Wow.
gap. So he was raised in the house. I had already moved out. I moved out when I was 19 and got my first apartment. And so he and I have a different relationship than me and my other siblings, because there's not the sibling rivalry because the age gap and then not being raised in that same house. It's a little bit different, but he my friends know he exists. Like, they know that there is a brown child living in my white parents' house. Like, and he's not a kid anymore. He'll be 17 in May, but he they know he exists. And so I worked with women also who knew that I have a brother who is Haitian. And the things that they would say directly, like not to me, but in front of me about Black people, I'm like, first of all, are you stupid? Because do you think I'm going to be okay with this? And then, second of all, like, why do you think that? Like, it's amazing to me how people think and how they justify these. Just it's just I mean, these I don't even know what to call it, but it's wrong factually. It's There's nothing to back up what they think other than what their parents or grandparents maybe have said. And that's very common for this rural Missouri area, to look at anyone differently and think that you're better than them. And I don't know, I don't know why it has hung on here as much as it has, other than like they see themselves reflected back because there's so many white people. But yeah, it's a thing that I'm glad I didn't learn as a child, like so many people that I know. My husband was not raised in a racist family by any means, but not in a super progressive one either. And so he had to kind of like realize, thinking that he had, that it was just not true, and like basically relearn things that he was taught as a child. And it's really tough. It's easier just to not do the work. And I think people, when you're in a position where you can just be around other people who look and act like you aren't challenged to have to make those changes. I made a comment once about having to, have a conversation with my parents, having to have a conversation with my brother about like what to do if you get pulled over, or because in a small town, most of them know him. So that, the local people pulling him over aren't probably going to be a problem. But if he goes to Kansas City, an hour away, it's like, what do you do? And I'm like, if I get pulled over, I don't have to do these things, but I purposely do exactly as we've told him to do, because if he has to do it, I should have to do it. And I want to make a point. I've done this with cops when I've gotten pulled over before. I don't move unless I say what I'm, reaching for. I keep my hands on the steering wheel. I tell them exactly what I'm doing. And they probably think I'm being ridiculous or dramatic. But if someone else has to do it to stay safe, everyone should have to do it.
I love that. I love that we're talking about this, right? Of like, it's not equality in terms of getting people like making them like putting the burden on the victim of whatever the discrimination or prejudice is of doing more. Like we should all be doing it. And I've had this conversation too about how like if you grow up in a household where you don't have a sister, right, these are still conversations you should be having, because you expect half of this population to talk to the other half, and you should all have the same common language or understanding of how certain processes are, how being human is, how being raised in a certain environment with like looking different is. Like that's so important. And I think like what I love about that, because you've touched on the concept of like needing to talk about it versus when you're in an environment where you're in the echo chamber and you don't ever have to talk about it. The only way to really make sure that we are anti-racist is to continue to talk about these things. And also for your personal development, it's almost impossible to work out all of these issues about identity and discrimination and how you feel about others or how others treat you without talking to somebody. And I think that's really like, to me, we'll likely never get rid of racism, but to make the world a better place, we have to make it more normal to discuss what discrimination looks like in our day to day, or like to feel safe talking about, hey, I didn't like the way that went down, and here's why I think that didn't go so well, or like why I think there might be some prejudice here, and feeling safe talking about those things and setting examples of like, okay, if we're going to make one person do it, then we all need to do it, because then you also don't forget. You don't get used to the idea that, oh, in a crowd of guys only, you don't have to do a lot of safety related things of like walking people to their cars, versus when you're in a mixed group or when you're all female group or whatever it is, right? A different mixture of identities. There are other norms that you have to adhere to. And if you give yourself permission to be lazy when you're not in those mixed situations, then you're opening the door to make the mistake when it's so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's one thing that's happened recently, well, within the last year, that I've seen a lot of media around is in country music. So I don't know if you listen to country at all, but
I do actually. It's my favorite music.
I'm so like all over the map when it comes to music. I love a little bit of everything. And so one thing with Morgan Wallen using the N-word last year, I've seen a lot of hate too. So Maren Morris has shunned him quite a bit. And just recently, I think it was at the CMAs, she actually like didn't clap, didn't stand when he won an award. I've seen so much hate directed her way at, for shunning him, for not giving him, a chance again. But this isn't the first time he's used the N-word and gotten caught. It's actually the second time. And he's doing a lot of his label is saying that he's putting in the work and he's doing a lot of learning, and maybe he is.
You're making excuses for the guy, like whatever.
It's like I've looked at people and just flat out asked, like, why do you have more anger at her for standing up and saying what he did is wrong than you do for him for doing the thing that was wrong? Like, why should we give him another chance, but we're going to punish her, which there's, sex plays into that as well.
This is entirely like, if you go back to like institutionalized religion and the way the Bible frames like, oh, if you're on your period, you need to go like live in a separate camp for a week. Like, excuse me, like segregation? Didn't we just do this?
We can't trust our emotions that week. We're going to be hysterical that week, It's like,
and we're not allowed to have emotions. And there's so many of these rules. Like circling back to like, growing up Asian American and what it looks like to be a girl, like the feminine type versus like being big and hairy and loud and all of those things. Like I remember as I was like, I think I must have been 11, 12, like around the age that I was starting to have crush on guys. My mom would tell me, "Oh, you should be more like your friend who's super quiet because guys like quiet girls and the like people who don't cause trouble, blah blah blah." My mom is not a quiet woman. Like this is like this absolute contradiction of like this is how you catch a guy, and the whole concept of like the fact that this is the level of the conversation, right? Of like catching the guy is the most important of your life, most important part of your life, or the most like the pinnacle of your accomplishments. Even though growing up Asian also meant yes, college is mandatory, and yes, you have to get a high paying job. Like, but somehow these conversations were like how to be attractive to a guy and how to be like to make it easy for a guy to like you instead of how to pick a guy that is worthy of you. And like this is very embedded in all of our culture and like very historically, and even like the whole okay, we gave black men the right to vote before we gave women the right to vote. Excuse me, like what? We still care about men before we care about our own like white people, women. So right, like what? I have all these observations about this stuff. But like we 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 have these like perfection expectations of women versus we do the whole like boys will be boys conversation when boys mess up and you just like let them slide because you think you agree it's like part of their nature to be a piece of shit. And then as a woman, you're supposed to be all these things and strong when a man leaves you and like all of the like somehow you're supposed to be everything. And that has never been unpacked, and I don't see a way to like address that in mass media yet. It's like the hardest part, I think, especially when we're talking about somebody standing up for themselves or for other people, right? Like arguably there is a sense like there is some privilege there to feel safe enough to be able to do that. I remember when Gamergate was a thing that a lot of the female reporters just flat out refused to be explicit about what was going on with that situation because they would get doxxed and attacked and like have their house vandalized. So it's very tough to be a woman and do what arguably is considered a feminine trait of standing up for other people, and then also be expected to be so nice and like non-threatening and all like it's so contradictory to be a woman in a public space. And I completely identify with that because to me as an Asian American, like you're doubly taught to be more private about yourself. Like if you had an argument in the family, if my dad slept in the car one night, like I wasn't supposed to tell anyone any of that shit. Like that was all like secret. Everybody's supposed to think we're a perfect happy family, which looking back, some of my classmates definitely thought we were a perfect happy family and we were not. And I continue to fight that cultural imperative to be quiet about how I grew up or who I am now, or when I mess up or when I'm in the process of growing, to not share those stories. But I am also one of my higher values is a concept of truth and transparency and leading for others and helping other people find their voice by being myself in a very public space, because I am comfortable with public speaking. I'm comfortable with being out there. I'm not as comfortable as I want to be, but I am more comfortable than a lot of my peers in the Asian American community. Mm-hmm. So this is something that I'm working on to be more visible. And I'm actually, I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm working on starting a podcast sometime in June. It will launch June, July timeframe, I think more likely July, of having a podcast around what it's like to be a first generation in a Western culture or in a new culture, like children of immigrants or an immigrant that came over really young, or even a first generation college student that is also then trying to start a business as a first generation business owner. So this is a part of my identity that I'm continuing to explore. And I have like that privilege that I'm comfortable doing it, and it's still a work in progress, but like it's a very weird dichotomy to say that you have a privilege for standing up for other people or representing for people and then still expecting to get attacked for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's anytime as a woman especially, but then I can only imagine as a woman who is of any type of minority, which honestly, depending on where you live, minority is not really the correct term anymore, but I can't imagine how hard it must be to have to defend yourself on so many fronts. You know, I know what it's like to have to defend myself for being a woman, whether it's because I was emotional, or I, whatever. I threatened someone in some way, and their attack is, well, against you as a woman. So I know what it's like to live that, but I can't imagine having to also then constantly be on the defensive, because you don't know who's coming at you from what side. And the internet is amazing in so many ways, but it's also brutal. um you know Most people won't walk up to you and say something hateful to your face, but they'll type it to you.
Oh yeah.
That's fine. And I'm like, do you realize, like, in this world, I could probably find you. Like, if you're telling me
Yes.
something hateful, I can probably find you
Yes.
and, like, figure out who you are, and we could have a face-to-face conversation. That would make me a crazy stalker, but so I'm not going to do it.
But this is a great point, right? If somebody can dox me, I can
Mhm.
dox them back. And I come from an IT background, so this is not impossible for me to figure out who you are, where you came from, like this. And I think that gives me, at least personally, a lot more power, because I think other people don't have that knowledge base, or don't have that sense of ability to go and fight back.
Mhm.
And it's all theoretical, right? Like, I wouldn't actually do this, but the fact that I could gives me a sense of power to not feel like an absolute victim. And of course, I haven't had the worst of it yet. I'm still very new to being more public, and I'm still only really talking in smaller circles right now. But like, having that sense of power, and then also honestly having empathy for, like, if they're typing crap at me, they're probably having a crap day. Or
Mhm.
when the very Asian movement came out with, like, the hashtag very Asian with Michelle Lee TV, and like, I listened to that recording, and first of all, the poor woman was drunk. Like, I don't, like, the person who left the voicemail was definitely drunk. um but I finished listening to it, and I was like, that woman has no idea where she comes from. She has no idea what a traditional, like, what to eat on New Year's thing would look like. And that gives her, like, such a sense of loneliness that she had to leave a drunk voicemail at a TV station.
It when I look at some of these comments, especially like on TikTok, I just tell myself to assume everyone is 13, because especially people who don't post videos themselves, you don't really know other than whatever their profile picture shows. And so it helps me to just assume that they're like 13. Their brain is still developing. Like, it gives me some empathy to be able to step back and say, okay, I don't need to tear this person apart. I just need to ignore the comment or answer it, directly and with some kindness, depending on the situation. But there's times where I can see this happens on Facebook mostly. The demographic on Facebook is older. The people who are leaving these comments a lot of times are in like the 40 to 60, sometimes older range, and they're bitter. And I don't know why. I mean, who knows what happened in their life to make them that way, but they're bitter and they're angry and they're trying to take it out on someone. And it's easy to do on the internet because you don't have very many repercussions. I mean, they're going to say what they want to say and feel like they did something and move on with their life. Um, this happened this summer in just a really like everyday way. We posted a picture. It was my husband, myself, and our three nieces went to Gulf Shores for vacation. And so we posted a picture of, we had a little company that came and they set up like a picnic, and then you take your dinner out to the beach. And so it was really cute. I asked for simple. I didn't, because they do these big elaborate, like for, proposals or
Mm.
bridal showers. I'm like, this is just family dinner. I want something simple. We're going to have spaghetti, so maybe not white tablecloths. And so they just did like little, the like planks with just like burlap over the top. So they brought out like pallets, and then they just did burlap. And we had, she did do a few like throw pillows just to make it cute. But I told her, even adults can't stay clean eating spaghetti. Like, we're going to get sauce on something. So please keep that in mind. And so she posted a picture, and this lady, I commented and was like, oh, thank you so much. We really appreciated it. This woman said, well, I've seen much cuter picnics. I don't know why you would decorate it that way. And I'm like, she wasn't saying it at me, but it was more towards the woman who had set it up. But I'm like, one, I specifically asked for simple because one, I didn't want to pay the price of these elaborate setups just for a fun dinner. Two, I knew we were going to be messy. And so this is what I asked for. Why are you, bashing this lady for giving me exactly what I wanted? And if you don't like it, like just scroll on. I just don't understand people. And so that was not a big thing. It was hateful, but it wasn't like,
Right, right. Like
completely
they
attacking her.
probably had no second thought of like the emotional impact they would have on
Mhm.
someone, or the number of people that would see that comment,
Yeah.
the impact it might have on that lady's business, or
Mhm.
on, like, she probably isn't in business herself, has no idea like what it looks like to have to adapt to your customers' tastes and expectations. Like, probably has never even worked like a volunteer job or a service
Mhm.
job, right? Like if you get to live your life without having to do any of those things, because arguably I have the privilege. I like went straight into like corporate America, but I did do volunteer things.
Mhm.
And there are ways to live in America without ever having to be in a position where you have to adapt to a customer's expectations. And like, I'm sure that person didn't give a single thought to it, thought that they were so smart and cool, and like they were have like, let me leave this sassy comment here to prove how great I am, and just
Mhm.
moved on.
Yeah, the icing on the cake. So I made a comment saying, she gave me exactly what I asked for. My middle niece was a little hot about it, and so she took a lot of time to write a comment. She edited it from the back seat quite a bit and kept passing it forward for me to read. And she had gone to the lady's profile and she had a quote, and it wasn't a scripture quote, but it was something referencing keep God in your life every day or something like that.
Sure.
And so of course my middle niece was like, really? And so she ended her comment with the exact same quote. And I'm like, oh my gosh.
This is what happens when you have great English teachers, though, is like you learn to go grab the proof and then like
Mhm.
throw it back at them at the bottom of your thesis.
Yeah.
Like that is, I expect she's had some great schooling from that perspective. It reminds me, my mom used to be a para educator, is what they call it now. Like, if they used to call it like a teacher's assistant, when you had larger class sizes, or in her later end of her career, she was helping at an adult school where like people were learning English or trying to get their citizenship. So her Mandarin came in super handy. And um, at some point, she was working with in a situation that was super stressful, and she was working part-time, so she had the option of scaling back her hours if she wanted to. It just depended on like getting her school principals like sign off that, yeah, you're going to switch you out, put somebody else in to support this particular teacher at this time slot or what have you. So she went to the doctor and got like a doctor's note that this was for her health, because it was true. She was her The stress was causing her heart rate to spike, and she has high blood pressure. So she got this note, she sent it to her union rep to ask for accommodation, which, if you're not familiar, is a legal term for you are legally required to do something about this, to make this okay for this person to work and still have a job and get paid based off of the work that they do deliver. But you are required by law to do something about it. It could be considered a disability, or it's a temporary like ailment that they need to have an accommodation for. So it's like when you put in a handicap ramp for
Mhm.
your handicap tenants and things like that, or having the push buttons or things like that. Or in my case, I get a standing desk because I have mild scoliosis in my back. So I would get a doctor's note for that. This union person, um, I got fired up the way your middle niece did, because basically they're like, can you like tell me what I forget how they basically like didn't understand the word accommodation in the sense of a noun. They read it wrong, and this is their job, okay? Like, you're in the union, your job is to accommodate. So I like I saw this email. My mom always sends me her more angry formal emails for me to help her fix her English.
Mhm.
um I like went to Google, got like the dictionary.com definition of the noun accommodate, put it in there, and then I was like, I'm sorry, your English is terrible, like blah 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 blah. Because I'm sure when my mom gets super passionate, her accent comes out. She
Mhm.
forgets how to put grammar into her words. And I'm sure they thought that they could beat my mom up for this. And I'm like, excuse me, she has a daughter that's that like went to
Mhm.
business school for crying out loud. So I told my mom, copy and paste exactly what I sent you, send it back to that woman, and she got the thing she needed.
Mhm. Yeah, it's amazing just what people try to get away with. Like, especially in that case, a union rep should know exactly what she was asking for. Um, yeah, people just they try to get away with anything that they can. They try to get away with as little work and effort
It's
as they
a
can.
factor of laziness, which that like this is the whole theme of like if we're talking discrimination and like not understanding other people's culture,
Mhm.
it goes back to being lazy. Which I don't blame anyone. They have other things going on in their lives. I have different priorities sometimes, but because I can't escape this identity, I can't take off my skin. I can dye my hair color anytime I want. That's not going to
Mhm.
change my face shape or the fact that I don't have double eyelids. I'm going to be recognized as an Asian. So this is a part of my life. And for me, that means it's integral to the things I pay attention to. Even though, we call it being a model minority, I get away with a lot more than a lot of other people of color in America do because I'm considered like the good minority, the one that's like smart and contributes to society and all that other bullshit. But like I have that middle ground privilege, but it's still something that I can't hide from other people. And for people who can get away with hiding, or like it's like I think the term being in the closet is so fair even outside of your sexual orientation. Because you're still hiding a part of yourself, or it's putting your panda into your talisman to bring it back to turning red. That some people get to do and others don't have that choice. And
Yeah.
so the laziness factor is a choice you have to consciously make sometimes if you want to improve in that space.
Hmm. Yeah. And for those who are listening who are, white and not having to step out and do, we haven't had to do the work until recently. And it's now at a point where you need to do the work. And so there's so many books. I'm actually going to put some in the show notes so that you guys can go to those, check them out, um, because it's time to step up and do the work. If you don't understand someone else because they're different, that doesn't make them wrong. It doesn't make them other. It just means you have differences and it's your job to learn about them. For how many hundreds of years at this point, culture and society has had to learn about what it's like to be white. That's all that, society has known. So it's time that we put in the work and learn what it's like to be from other cultures and what other cultures have had to live with because of us in most cases. This, our, our society really, I mean, we could talk about systemic racism, which I really think a lot of white people have a hard time understanding because
I have
so
to have this conversation all the time. My
yeah,
roommate is white,
I'm going
so
to tell a story on myself, so that I don't use other people in this. This was how I came to understand white privilege, because for a very long time it was a term. I'd say up until maybe 5 years ago, it was a term that kind of rubbed me the wrong way because I've had to work for everything I have. My family isn't rich, so I kind of roll my eyes like, okay, I mean, I get it, but at the same time I don't get it because I've had to work for everything. I watched a video, and if I can find this again, I'll link it in the show notes too, but it was a video of a bunch of college age kids who were standing in a line and they were going to race, and they asked several questions, and if you could answer yes to those questions, you got to take a step forward. And the questions were things like, did you grow up with both parents in your household? Did you, attend school every day? Did you ever have to get a job to help support your family? That type of thing. And they would have been asked differently so that, if your parents were still in the home, you took a step forward. If you've never had to work a job, you got to take a step forward. The camera panned and it showed right before they were getting ready to start, the people who got to step forward were predominantly white. There were people still in the back who were white. There were people who had gotten to take some steps forward who were maybe Asian or who were, Black, Native American, but the majority of the people were white. And it like hit me like a punch in the gut. I finally got it. Like, yes, we, I have had to work for everything I had, but I didn't have roadblocks in my way. We don't all have the same starting point. And to me, I'm super visual. So it literally took me watching it play out in front of me to see it. And I've had this conversation with my grandpa, because he had the same reaction that I did at first. He kind of, made him kind of take a step back and go, well, I've worked for everything I had. And I'm like, you did, but you didn't have a society that was actively working against you. So it's not negating your hard work. It's just saying that other people had to overcome different things, and those things were bigger than what you had to overcome, because they were in addition to. They weren't just working hard. They also had people who were actively working against them. They had a society that was working against them. And so it really took me doing a lot of self-reflection and realizing that, saying that someone else had it hard doesn't mean that I didn't also have struggles. And it doesn't take away from what I've accomplished to say that they also have accomplished things and they had to do it differently and they had to work harder to do it.
Yeah, I think that comes back to like it circles around. We haven't explicitly said like this is about your self-confidence in your identity and your roots or what you've earned or what you have entitlement to. Like when you start attacking other groups, it's because you're not confident in where you come from or that you've earned it. And the that illustration in terms of the race and the way systemic racism shows up is not like this is again we're not looking to create a new generalization, we're just trying to create awareness that things are different. And I like to articulate this feeling of like, yes, you've earned where you are, but other people have had like other struggles that are probably more painful. It's the difference between having just an economic mobility, because my roommate comes from rural America, like in the middle of West Virginia, and like he didn't have access to the greatest education. West Virginia has some great teachers, so that like that is still fairly good for him. But for him, he moved from blue collar into white collar society, and that's economic mobility. The distinction is what is socioeconomic mobility, of like, not only do I have to fight for my right to belong in the room to learn, but then when I go to apply for jobs that I get rejected based off of having a foreign looking name, or once they see my picture on LinkedIn, they're like, no, that doesn't fit our culture. Like that, like these things where you get to like throw the word culture around as if it justifies your racism. Like, and that's where the systemic racism comes in, is because this fear of something different, that studies have shown that the more diversity you have in your group, the better off your company is, or the better ideas you get, or the more successful financially you are. But it's so easy to return to that box of like, no, I want everybody to be in like my macho, like super competitive culture, or oh, we want to have like a non-contentious space, which is just another way of saying that you don't like actually brainstorm and have like innovative ideas. But like there are ways that systemic racism shows up that sound neutral and they sound nice, but when you dig deep into like what that actually looks like in terms of actual behaviors and who you let in or out, that go way beyond your ability to earn a financial living or having a stable household. It's about having doors slammed in your face that you didn't expect to be slammed because you grew up in America and you were told that this is the melting pot where everybody has an equal opportunity to that American dream. So it's actually, I would almost argue, almost triple like of a threat, because you're lied to that you have a place here when you grow up, that if you were born here, that you are a citizen and you have a right to be here. And then you've got people explicitly telling you to go back to your country. The distinction between what the word nationality means and what race means. And I know the like racism has become such a bad word that the word race has become a bad word, but I don't want people to shy away from that word, because to me, being Chinese American is my race. My nationality is I'm just American. And that distinction is super important to understand the feeling of, on paper, I have a right to something, and yet I can still end up on a subway station in New York having a white man yell at me to go back to my country. Where, by the way, they wouldn't welcome me either because I don't speak fluent Mandarin.
But like you said, I don't think racism ever goes completely away. I wish, my hope is that it does, but there are enough people that are actively like entrenching themselves in not just systemic racism, but overt racism, like that I don't know what the end is. And I absolutely hate that for especially our country, because I mean, we really are as a country kind of a hot mess. In so many ways. It's not just with racism. I mean, we're a mess. And it's like trying to put out so many fires at once. Sometimes I'm just tired. And this is coming, obviously, I just have struggled being a woman in this country, but I'm still white. I still have a lot of privilege that a lot of people don't. But even then, I still am just tired some days of all the fires that need put out. It's like, where do we devote our energy? Like, which one do we tackle first? And I think that's part of the problem.
We're trying to solve equivalent to world peace, right? Because this is the foundation. This is the root of why we don't have world peace, because of having like the concept that we can call somebody an outgroup and justify killing them for it. But I think I want to end with permission to people that this conversation is about educating and taking the pieces that you feel like you do have the energy to absorb and incorporate into a growth aspect of your identity. It's not about expecting everybody to do the work at the same level of expectations or to get it all done in the next 2 days or like in your free time or whatever you want to call it, right? This is about surrounding yourself with people who are having these conversations and then slowly adopting the pieces that resonate with you, that feel relatable, or that you want to see show up in your life because they're important to something going on in your personal circle, in your day to day, that you can have an impact on, that you can make a change for somebody, that if you do have privilege, that you can stand up for them and make their lives better. And you would be surprised how grateful they will be if somebody becomes their ally and says, hey, I'm not comfortable with the way you said that. We need to be more inclusive and more aware of how we word things, because words do have power. And this is not about expecting everybody to do all of the work. It's about having the conversation and making sure that conversation continues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. The open communication is honestly, when you keep the doors open, you keep communication flowing, it's a lot harder to just close yourself off to, to anyone, whether it's because of they're a different gender, they're a different religion, they're a different race, whatever it is. If you can keep communication open and just try to be kind to people, because if you're acting out of kindness, even if you're ignorant, most people can see that and they will, redirect you or, help you to learn, versus just, when you're ignorant and you're acting out of fear or out of hatred, that's where the problems begin. So I'm so glad that you were able to hop on here with me. This film, obviously, it represents so much. It's not just, to me, it's not just a kid's film. In last week's episode, we talked so much on like child development and parenting. And then today, touching on racism and inequality, especially in our country. I feel like there's a lot that can be learned from this film. So
yeah. I basically just described it of like, this was my childhood. Mm-hmm. It wasn't my town, and it wasn't the same, like the same friendships or what have you, but this was my childhood. I cried several times during that movie. That parent-daughter relationship was a huge aspect of growing up as an Asian in a Western culture. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing that a lot more lately in the media about like, what does that relationship look like, or how, like that's super conflict. And I want to thank you, Megan, for having me on to have this conversation, because it is a contentious conversation, even beyond the puberty stuff that I'm sure you got a lot of back and forth on your previous episode, but that I want to express my appreciation that when I volunteered to speak on Turning Red and I pointed out that the other volunteers were all white women, that you took that in stride and you found ways for me to show up as myself representing my people without putting me in an awkward situation. And this has been a great conversation. So my heartfelt thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much. I've learned so much from you today, and I'm excited for this episode to air. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Megan.